Cain just killed his own brother. That's technically the first murder in all of human history, and I need you to sit with that for a second before I keep going. Abel is dead. Cain is standing there, probably holding some kind of farming tool the text never actually names, and I appreciate that honestly because it leaves it up to my imagination, and my imagination always lands on something deeply inconvenient, like a garden hoe. God shows up and asks him what he did. Cain knows he's in trouble. He's about to be cursed to wander the earth, lose the ability to farm, lose his home, his family, basically everything. And Cain's response to all of that isn't to beg for mercy. It's to say, my punishment is greater than I can bear, and whoever finds me is going to kill me. Hold on. Who? If you grew up in church, you've probably heard this story a dozen times, and there's a good chance you never stopped on that specific detail. Because in the most traditional reading, the one taught most often, the entire population of Earth at this exact moment is 3 people: Adam, Eve, and Cain. Abel is dead. So who exactly is Cain so afraid of? I glossed over this for years. And when I finally stopped to actually pay attention, it got even weirder, because God's response isn't, "There's no one out there, Cain, relax." God's response is to put a protective mark on him. A mark whose entire stated purpose is to stop whoever finds him from killing him. And God goes even further. He promises that whoever kills Cain will suffer 7-fold vengeance. That doesn't sound like precaution against a hypothetical threat. That sounds like a divine protection program against a real, specific threat, with real people behind it. And look, I know this sounds like biblical conspiracy theory territory, poking at a detail like this. But stick with me, because once you stack this detail on top of 4 more that Genesis 4 simply never explains, the wife Cain finds out of nowhere, the city he somehow builds by himself, the name of a place that already existed before he got there, you realize it's not one isolated oddity. It's a pattern. And today I want to walk you through that entire pattern, plus a lesser-known academic reading that, in my opinion, accounts for every piece of it without inventing anything the text doesn't already say. Fair warning, this is going to get a little technical in places, but stick with me, because it changes how you read the first 2 chapters of the Bible, period. Without further ado, let's get into it. And if you're into deep dives like this one, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel out. Before we get into the theory, the scholarly debate, and the Mesopotamian archaeology, and we will get there, I promise, it's going to be good. I need to walk through Genesis 4 with you slowly, because most people know this story in a general sense without ever noticing how strange the details actually are once you look closely. The text says Adam knew Eve. She conceived and bore Cain, and later bore his brother Abel. Abel kept the flocks, Cain worked the ground. Each of them brings an offering, Cain from the fruit of the ground, Abel from the firstborn of his flock. God has regard for Abel's offering and rejects Cain's. Cain gets furious, his face falls. God asks him why he's angry, warns him that sin is crouching at the door, and Cain kills his brother out in the field anyway. God asks where Abel is. Cain gives that famous line, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And then comes the curse. "You'll be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." This is where Cain says the line that opened this video. "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Whoever finds me will kill me." God responds with the mark and the promise of sevenfold vengeance. Cain goes to the land of Nod, east of Eden, knows his wife. She conceives. Enoch is born, and Cain builds a city which he names after his son. 5 paragraphs. That's the entire text. And packed into those 5 paragraphs are 5 things that, if you actually stop and think about them, shouldn't make any sense in a world of there are only 3 people alive on the planet. The first is the fear. Cain isn't afraid of one specific, immediate danger. He's describing an entire lifetime of running, a fugitive and a wanderer, an ongoing threat from an ongoing population he expects to run into again and again over the years. That's not the kind of fear you have of your own mother. The second is the mark. A protective mark only makes sense if there's someone to protect against. And the promise of sevenfold vengeance implies, in no uncertain terms, that there are enough people out there for killing Cain to be a real possibility God actively needs to discourage. The third is the name of the place. Nod already has a name before Cain ever gets there. Places get names because people name them, and they become known because multiple people use that name. East of Eden describes a direction. The land of Nod describes a specific, already identified territory. The fourth is the wife. She just shows up. No introduction, no explanation, no prior genealogy. Cain knew his wife and we just move on. And the fifth is the city. The Hebrew word used here, in its ancient Near Eastern context, refers to an actual walled settlement, the kind of thing that requires organized labor, agricultural surplus to feed people who aren't farming, people who know how to work stone, people who know how to dig. You cannot build that with a wife and a newborn. And this is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the most common explanation for this entire puzzle has a problem almost nobody points out. The most common explanation, the one you've probably already heard, goes like this. Genesis is compressing a massive amount of time. Cain didn't show up in Nod, find a wife, and build a city within a matter of months. This happened over generations. Genesis 5:4 literally says Adam had other sons and daughters. So the idea is that over time that population grew, those siblings intermarried, because there was no prohibition against it yet, and no other option, and after centuries, the population was finally large enough for Cain to find a wife among his nieces, and for there to be enough people to build a settlement. And look, technically that works. The lifespans in Genesis are famously enormous. Adam lives to 930 years old, which, taken literally, means he was potentially alive almost all the way up to Noah. So the idea of hundreds of descendants multiplying over centuries isn't impossible. There's even an old Jewish tradition, in the Genesis Rabbah, an ancient rabbinic commentary that proposes something even more specific, that Cain's wife was actually Abel's twin sister, born alongside him. I still want to do a whole video on some of this rabbinic material someday, because sometimes these traditions are fascinating and sometimes they genuinely make no sense at all. But this one, at least, tries to tackle the problem head on. And look, I need to give this explanation its due for one more second, because it's not crazy. Ancient Near Eastern genealogies frequently skip whole generations. That's a well-documented phenomenon, and Hebrew writers weren't necessarily listing father, son, grandson without gaps. Begat in Hebrew could mean was the ancestor of, not strictly directly fathered. So technically, between Cain begat Enoch and the founding of the city, there could be room for a much longer stretch of time than a surface reading suggests. That's true, and I don't want to wave it away carelessly. The problem isn't that this explanation is impossible. The problem is the text doesn't give you any of it. It never tells you time is passing. It never shows you the daughters being born. It just narrates Cain going to Nod, finding a wife, and building a city, like it's the most natural sequence of events in the world, with zero signal that entire generations passed behind the scenes. Ancient Near Eastern scholars point to this exact issue. The traditional reading, to work, either has to affirm that only Adam, Eve, and Cain are alive after Abel's death, which is the plain implication of the text, or it has to invent long stretches of time the text simply doesn't provide, plus even more time to justify a city that one man couldn't have built alone. Neither option fully sits right with me. So let me show you another way to read this, a minority view, I'll admit, but one I find genuinely fascinating enough to build an entire video around. Here's the turn. And before I go further, an honest disclosure. I'm a Christian. I believe in the authority of Scripture. I believe it's God's Word. And I believe the reading I'm about to walk you through is, in my opinion, more faithful to what the text literally says than the traditional reading is. But I need to be straight with you. This is disputed territory. Smart people disagree about it, and I'm presenting it because I find it genuinely interesting and compelling, not because it's consensus. It all starts with a simple question. Are Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 the same story told twice, or are they two different accounts describing two different things? In Genesis 1, God creates the entire cosmos, sky, water, land, vegetation, sun, moon, stars, animals, and on the sixth day, He creates humanity. And the wording here matters. Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth. There's no Adam and Eve by name yet, no Garden of Eden, just humanity told to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, not a garden, the whole earth, and to have dominion over it. The sixth day ends, everything is good, and Genesis 2:1-3 gives you the seventh day, the day of rest, because the entire work of creation is already complete. And then pay attention to this. Genesis 2:4 opens with the phrase, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created." That exact phrase, "These are the generations of," shows up over and over throughout Genesis. You'll see it introducing Noah, introducing the table of nations, introducing the line of Shem. And every single time it appears, it's introducing a new, distinct lineage or narrative, something being set apart from what came before. And the very next verse says, "No bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground." Wait. No man. After humanity was already created in Genesis 1. The traditional reading resolves this by saying Genesis 2 is just a zoom, In on day 6, taking the wide-angle shot of the creation of the cosmos in Genesis 1, and narrowing in on the specific creation of Adam and Eve. But read it on its own terms for a second. Genesis 1 creates humanity to fill the entire earth. Genesis 2 describes one specific man, formed from the dust of one specific patch of ground, placed in one specific garden, in one specific geographic region called Eden, which has 4 rivers flowing out of it. These are clearly not the same scale of event. Genesis 1 is a broad, global creation. Genesis 2 is a local, particular, specific one. So the question becomes, what if Genesis 1 is describing the creation of humanity broadly? All the human beings who will go on to fill the earth and exercise general dominion over it. And Genesis 2 is describing something different. The creation of 2 specific people, Adam and Eve, set apart for a particular purpose, in a particular place. This is what scholars call pre-Adamism or co-Adamism. The idea that there were already human beings alongside Adam and Eve who weren't descended from their line, created the way Genesis 1 describes, filling the wider earth, while Adam and Eve were taken and set apart for a distinct role. I'm not saying this is definitely what happened. I'm saying someone can read Genesis this way, for a legitimate reason, because it accounts for exactly the things the traditional reading has to invent extra time to justify. And if that's true, what exactly was Adam and Eve's specific role? Most people assume the image of God refers to some set of qualities humans have: reason, speech, emotion, free will, a soul, things that make us special and distinct from animals. Those things are real, but scholars like Michael Heiser argue that's not actually what Genesis means by the phrase Tselem Elohim, the image of God. In the ancient Near East, an image was a physical representation of a ruler, installed in a territory to extend that ruler's authority over that place. Egyptian pharaohs planted images of themselves all across the empire. Wherever the statue stood, that territory was understood to be under the king's authority. So when God creates humanity in his image, the very next command in Genesis 1:28 is the dominion mandate: have dominion over the birds, the animals, the whole earth. Image and dominion go together. To be made in God's image is to be his physical representative on earth, installed there to extend his authority over creation. It's less a trait you possess and more a vocation, a calling. It's not something you simply have. It's something you do, and at the same time something you are, purely by virtue of being human. And this wasn't just an Egyptian custom, by the way. Assyrian and Babylonian kings did essentially the same thing, erecting victory steels and royal images at conquered borders or distant frontiers of the empire, specifically so anyone passing through would know, without a doubt, whose authority that land answered to. It's basically a physical embassy, permanently planted in the ground. This territory answers to this authority. So when Genesis borrows exactly that vocabulary, image, likeness, to describe the creation of humanity, it's borrowing the single most recognizable political language of the ancient world and applying it, in a genuinely shocking move for the original audience, not to a king or a pharaoh, but to all of humanity. That alone is worth an entire video. The radical idea that in the ancient world, only the king was the image of God. And Genesis flips that completely on its head by saying every human being carries that status. But today, I need to stay focused on what that specifically means for Adam, Eve, and Cain's problem. And this is where everything connects to what I've been building since the start of this video. If the image of God is a functional status, a vocation of representation, then what makes Adam and Eve's creation in Genesis too distinct isn't that they received the image of God for the first time. It's that they received a specific, elevated version of that calling. They're not just humans placed on earth to fill it and exercise general dominion. They're placed in the Eden sanctuary. And if you've seen my video on the Garden of Eden not actually being a garden but a temple, and if you haven't, it's linked in the description. I genuinely recommend it. You'll get exactly what I mean here. Adam and Eve are essentially the priests of God's earthly dwelling place. They're the human representatives of God's headquarters on earth. Eden is the place where heaven and earth overlap, where God's presence is fully manifest, where the boundary between the divine realm and the human realm nearly disappears, and Adam and Eve are the ones put in charge of it. And that's a massive, specific, unique calling, completely different from the general mandate given to humanity in Genesis 1. Genesis 1. Humanity fills the earth. Genesis 2. One specific couple tends God's sanctuary. That's not the same job. And if it's not the same job, it might not be exactly the same population doing it. So back to Cain. If there were other human beings alive at the same time as Adam and Eve, not their descendants, but people created in the broader sense of Genesis 1, filling the wider world out there, outside of Eden, suddenly everything in Genesis 4 gets a lot less strange. Cain fears whoever finds him will kill him. Makes sense because there are other people in the world. God gives him a protective mark. The mark makes sense because there are real people Cain needs protecting from. Cain goes to the land of Nod. It already has a name because there are already people living there who already named it. Where does Cain's wife come from? Apparently she's one of the people of Nod, someone from the broader population Genesis 1 already described. And finally, he builds a city with enough people to build it because he moved into a region that already had a population. None of that requires inventing time gaps the text doesn't give you. None of it requires imagining Adam and Eve having dozens of off-screen children before any of this could happen. The text, even if not explicitly, points toward other people already being present. And the traditional reading, the one that looks, on the surface, like the more literal option, actually requires you to fill in far more information than the text ever gives you. And I need to hold on to something here, because it's going to come back soon and completely change how you look at this city Cain builds. This city isn't just a logistical solution to a population problem. It's a statement. And to understand why, we need to understand what a city actually meant in the ancient world. And that's exactly where this gets genuinely fascinating. Before I move on to the city, let me close one loop that keeps nagging at me every time I reread this passage. If Adam and Eve were taken and set apart specifically to tend the sanctuary of Eden, then their fall isn't just a personal mistake. It's a priesthood abandoning its post. It's the guard walking off the gate. And if there really was a broader humanity out there, outside the garden, that broader humanity never carried that exact responsibility, which might be why the weight of the fall lands specifically on Adam's line, and not on the entire species at once. I know that raises another huge question, something like Romans 5, which talks about sin entering the world through one man, and honestly that's a longer conversation than I have time for today. But I think it's worth sitting with that possibility for a second before we move forward. And here's a question I think most people never ask out loud. If there was a broader population outside of Eden, what does that change about exactly who Cain runs into in Nod? Because it's not just the wife. It's the whole city. It's people who know how to work stone. People who know how to dig, raise walls, organize a harvest large enough to feed everyone who isn't farming. Nod isn't an empty space Cain fills by himself. Nod is an already existing society with its own culture, its own name, and probably its own history the text simply doesn't bother telling because, and this matters, telling that story was never the point of the narrative. And think about this too. In the ancient world, running into a stranger wandering alone through someone else's territory was not a neutral event. Cities had gates and gates had guards, and guards existed specifically to decide who got in and who didn't. A man with no clan, no family to protect him, no one to answer for him, was exactly the kind of person who could be killed without consequence, because there was no one left to avenge his death. That's why blood vengeance, the goal, the kinsman, redeemer who avenges a murder, was so central to that culture. Without a clan, you had zero protection. Cain, having just lost the only brother he had, was exposed in exactly that way. No clan, no avenger. And that's precisely the gap God's mark fills. God is functionally stepping into the role of Cain's goal, the avenger he no longer has. And this is exactly where it gets interesting in a different way, because it also explains why the text doesn't spend a single second justifying the presence of these people. It's not that the author forgot to mention it. It's that the author never thought it needed mentioning. To whoever wrote Genesis 4, the existence of other people outside Adam's line appears to be an assumed fact, not a problem to solve. And unexplained assumptions are usually the strongest sign that something was obvious to the original writer. It just stopped being obvious to us, thousands of years later, reading with completely different assumptions. So hold on to that thought too, because now, finally, let's talk about cities in the ancient world. And when I say ancient, I mean genuinely ancient. We're talking 5,000–6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Back then, cities weren't primarily economic or defensive structures, even though they were both of those things too. Cities were how human beings imposed order on chaos, which is, incidentally, a theme the entire Bible keeps coming back to. Cities were physical statements of a civilization, of a people, of a specific answer to the question of how human life should be organized and under whose authority. Founding a city was, functionally, an act of world-making. You were declaring that this territory now had a center, a structure, a people, a god. You were planting a flag in the ground and saying, "This is how things work here." Hold on to that, because now I need to remind you of something. God had just cursed Cain to wander. The punishment was specifically about not having a home. You don't belong anywhere, Cain. You're going to be a wanderer. That's the sentence. And Cain, after hearing that, goes to Nod, whose name, by the way, literally comes from the Hebrew root for wandering, and does the exact opposite of what the curse demanded. He builds a city. The man who had just been cursed to wander responds to that curse by constructing a permanent city. He can't farm anymore, so he builds something more ambitious than a farm. He was told he'd never have a home, so he builds the most permanent kind of home there is, a walled city, bearing his son's name, in territory that was already known and already populated. And there's a second layer here that's even more interesting. There's a reading where Cain is trying to recreate the belonging he lost, trying to build a world for his son that he himself can no longer access. But there's also an explicitly defiant reading, Cain answering God's curse with a counter-proposal. God says, "You'll wander." Cain says, "No." God says, "You'll have no home." Cain says, "Watch me build one." And that pattern, humanity constructing its own security apart from God instead of receiving it as a gift from God, is going to show up again and again throughout the rest of the Bible. The most obvious callback is Babel, which I already made a full video on, where the builders say, literally, "Let us build ourselves a city and a tower, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth." They're afraid of wandering too. They also want a permanent place, a center, an identity. But they want it entirely on their own terms. And God's response to Babel is essentially the same response he gave Cain, except instead of a mark, he scatters them and lets them wander anyway. It's also worth noting that the Hebrew word translated city in this passage, the one I mentioned earlier, is the same root later used for entire walled Canaanite cities, complete with gates and towers. It's not a word casually used for village or camp. The author of Genesis deliberately chose the heaviest available word to describe what Cain built. And if you've seen my video on the Tower of Babel, you know this exact pattern. People erecting monumental structures in response to fear and judgment becomes practically a signature of early Genesis. Ziggurats, walls, towers, brick instead of stone, tar instead of mortar. Always the same question underneath. How does humanity respond to chaos and judgment? By building or by trusting? But now I need to tell you about a document called the Sumerian King List, because this is where things get a little surreal. If you've never heard of it, good for you. I hadn't either until pretty recently. And if you had heard of it before me, I'd honestly be a little concerned about you. The Sumerians were one of the earliest civilizations on Earth, based in ancient Mesopotamia, in what's now Iraq. And they're basically the people who invented writing, organized cities, organized agriculture, and a whole lot else. Among the documents that survived them is a list enumerating all the kings of the major Sumerian cities, tracing back to the very beginning of human civilization, according to them. The Sumerian king list opens with this line: "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Eridu was the first city that, according to the Sumerians, all human civilization traces back to. And the list goes on to name the kings of Eridu and the cities that followed, along with how long each one reigned. And I need to prepare you, because these numbers are not what you'd call realistic. We're talking about kings who reigned for 20, 8,800 years, 30, 6,000 years, 40, 3,200 years. And after these 8 kings with their extraordinary reigns, the list essentially ends with a line that says, "Then the flood swept over." 8 pre-flood kings. Then a flood. Then civilization starts over. Now look at Genesis. In Genesis 4, you get the genealogy of Cain's line, starting with Cain himself, running through several generations of descendants. And in Genesis 5, you get the genealogy of Seth's line: Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah, who survives the flood. 8 figures between Adam and Noah. Then a flood. Then civilization starts over. The parallels between the Genesis narrative and this Sumerian king list have been noted by scholars for over a century. But what's genuinely strange, and this is where it gets fascinating, is the names. Hold that thought, because I've been sitting on this connection since the start of this video. And now, finally, it's time to show you. The first city on the Sumerian king list is Eridu. The patron god of Eridu was Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom and water, one of the most important deities in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon. Now look again at Genesis 4:17. Cain names his city after his son. His son's name is Enoch. Enoch and Enki aren't identical names. I need to be upfront about that. But scholars working with Hebrew grammar and Akkadian phonetics point out that if you apply the standard rules of vowel assimilation between the 2 languages, the kind of sound shift that's extremely common when a word crosses from one Semitic language into another language of the same region, the 2 words converge on a very close consonantal root. And look, I'll be honest with you. I just threw in some Hebrew linguistics here that I don't fully have a technical grip on myself. But the scholars who did this work do, and their point holds up. The god of wisdom who dwells in the first Sumerian city, and the man whose name gets given to the first biblical city, share the same root name, or something extremely close to it. And it doesn't stop there. Hold on again, because once you see this, you genuinely can't unsee it. Enoch, Cain's son, has a son named Irad. And the first Sumerian city, Eridu, according to reconstructed Sumerian grammar, would have been pronounced very close to Urudu. Irad, Eridu. That's not a 2-letter coincidence. It's a pattern across 2 consecutive generations, the son's name echoing the original city, and the grandson's name echoing the name of the founding city of the Sumerians itself. Scholars from multiple institutions, the Journal of the Origins, the Armstrong Institute of Biblical Archaeology among them, have pointed out that the city named Enoch in Genesis 4 is very likely the same city the Sumerians called Eridu, and that the name got preserved in the biblical text 1 generation later, in the name of Cain's grandson. In other words, Genesis and the Sumerian king list are describing the same city. The first city, and both texts agree on where it was located in Mesopotamia, in the ancient river delta that's now southern Iraq, near modern Basra. Pause and read that again, because I think this is the single most important moment in the entire video. The earliest archaeological excavations at the site of Eridu found evidence of habitation going back to roughly 5400 BC, making it one of the oldest confirmed settlements on the face of the earth. This isn't legend. This isn't speculative reconstruction. It's a real place, excavated, cataloged, dated. And it's not just one isolated layer of dirt. Eridu was excavated, revealing 18 stacked layers of temples, each one built literally on top of the last, over thousands of years, as if every generation insisted on rebuilding the same sanctuary in the exact same spot, dedicated to the exact same God, Enki, over and over, layer after layer, for more than 1,500 years straight. That kind of unbroken religious continuity at the exact same point on the map is extremely rare in world archaeology. The people who lived there clearly believed that specific ground was sacred, and they kept coming back to it, generation after generation. The city Cain builds according to Genesis, and the city the Sumerians say is the first city of humanity according to the king list, are the same place. Same location, completely different stories about who built it and why. The Sumerians say Eridu's kingship descended from heaven, that the city was a glorious gift, the blessed beginning of everything. Genesis says the opposite. Genesis says a man under divine judgment, marked, driven out of God's presence, fled and raised walls to hide behind. Both texts know the same city. They simply disagree completely about what it means. One side celebrates the origin of civilization as a gift descending from heaven. The other side narrates the origin of civilization as an act of running, of a man trying to build security far away from the presence of God. And that's what changes everything, because it means Genesis 4 isn't a story invented in a vacuum, isolated, cut off from the world around it. Genesis 4 is in direct conversation with the oldest tradition of Mesopotamia itself. The author knew about Eridu, knew about the tradition of a first city at the dawn of civilization, and instead of simply repeating that tradition, offered a completely distinct theological interpretation of it, one that puts a man under divine judgment at the center of the founding of human civilization, in direct defiance of the God who told him he'd wander. The city named Enoch, built by a wandering man, in a land whose name literally means wandering, is still there, under the ancient ruins of southern Iraq, under the name Eridu, where the oldest evidence of urban life on the planet has ever been found, where the Sumerians said kingship descended from heaven, and where Genesis says a cursed man built walls to run from God. Same city, different stories. So let me try to pull all of this together, because I know that was a lot. Genesis 4 tends to get read as a logistical nightmare, a narrative that raises questions about population, genetics, and incest that we have to kind of awkwardly explain away before we can even get to the theological point of the passage. I grew up in the church my entire life, and I cannot count the number of times I've heard someone say that the single most embarrassing question a non-Christian can ask about Genesis is, where did Cain get his wife? As if the correct answer is always some slightly apologetic version of it was a different time back then. Things were different. But I think there's something far more interesting going on here. I think Genesis 4 assumes a wider human world because Genesis 1 already created a wider human world, and the author felt zero need to stop and explain that, because it was never the point of the story in the first place. The point was something else. The point was what happens to the image, bearers who were set apart for a special role, Adam and Eve, when that role gets abandoned. and what happens to their descendants who carry forward both the image and the failure. Cain's line in Genesis 4 is presented as an entire vision of civilization. They build cities. They invent metallurgy. The text says explicitly that Tubal, Cain, one of Cain's descendants, was the forger of every instrument of bronze and iron. They develop music. Jubal is described as the father of all who play the lyre and pipe. They develop organized animal husbandry. Jabal is the father of those who dwell in tents and keep livestock. It's the portrait of an entire civilization with everything it should have, just built apart from God. And then in Genesis 4:26, after Seth's line is already established, Adam and Eve have another son, and that son is named Seth, and it's his line that continues on. The text says that at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. At this point, there are now two civilizations, one building without God, the other calling on his name. And the entire trajectory of Genesis, really the entire trajectory of the whole Bible, follows exactly that dividing line, not just between two individuals, not just between two families, but between two fundamentally different ways of being human in the world. The city builders, the self-secured people, raising walls against the judgment they themselves brought on. That pattern runs straight through to Babel and keeps going after that. And on the other side, there are the ones who keep calling out, in the middle of the mess and exile of a fallen world, on the name of the God who's still there to answer. And I don't think that dividing line stayed in the past. I think it's still very much alive, just wearing different clothes. Everybody builds something to feel secure. A job, a reputation, a bank account, a carefully curated social media presence, an airtight resume. None of that is inherently wrong, and I'm not going to sit here pretending I'm some kind of virtuous exception to that rule, because I'm not. But there's a massive difference between building something as a response to the fear of being exposed and vulnerable, and building something as an act of gratitude for already having been received. Cain built his city because he was afraid, because he was ashamed, because he wanted to prove to himself and to the world that he still had worth, even after doing the worst thing a human being can do. And honestly, I get that impulse deeply, because it's basically the engine behind a good chunk of my own decisions on bad days. The question this text seems to keep asking me, every time I reread it, isn't do you build things? Everybody builds things. The question is, are you building while running or building while resting? Are you raising walls because you're afraid of being found? Or are you putting down roots because you already know you've been found, and somehow, strangely and generously, still got handed a mark of protection? And there's one more detail inside Cain's own line worth mentioning before I close this out. 7 generations after Cain, a man named Lamech shows up, and Lamech sings a song to his own wives, a song that basically brags about killing a man for wounding him, and says that if Cain would be avenged sevenfold, he, Lamech, will be avenged 77-fold. It's the exact same language as Cain's original protective mark, except now it's been twisted, turned into a weapon, into a threat. The protection God gave as mercy becomes, a few generations later, a reason for violent pride. It's the sharpest possible portrait of a civilization drifting further and further away, faster and faster. The same language, the same promise, completely emptied of any humility. None of this is fully settled, and I want to be honest with you about that before I close out. Scholars disagree on nearly everything I talked about today. The two distinct creation accounts reading has critics who think it imports too much into the text that isn't actually there. The pre-Adamism and co-Adamism proposal makes a lot of people nervous, sometimes for genuinely legitimate theological reasons. And like always on this channel, I try to present different views fairly and present my opinions exactly as that, opinions. Some things are more defensible than others for sure, and speculating can be fun. But I can't sit here and tell you this is definitively the true reading, even though, yes, I think it makes a lot of sense. What I can tell you is that the next time someone asks you where Cain got his wife, you'll probably have a better answer than it was probably his sister. It was a different time. You'll have a textual argument, a scholarly framework, and a Sumerian parallel connecting the first city of Genesis to the first city of Mesopotamian archaeology itself, plus a theological reading of why any of this matters in the first place. So did Cain really build that city despite being cursed, or precisely because of the curse? I think the most honest answer is, he built it because of it. He answered God's judgment with an ego-driven counterproposal, something he chose to name, something he chose to raise. I was here, my son was here, this territory is mine now. And as far as we can tell, he built it in a world that was already full of people he didn't create and didn't descend from. People who were already filling the earth exactly the way Genesis 1 always said they would. And if you really sit with that, maybe that's the loneliest possible version of this story. The man who walked out of God's presence and straight into a world full of people, and still somehow ended up completely alone. I genuinely hope you enjoyed this video, and that you learned something new today. If you're into biblical deep dives like this one, consider subscribing to the channel. It's free and it really helps out. Let me know down in the comments, do you buy this pre-Adamism reading, or do you think the traditional explanation holds up just fine? Thank you so much for watching. You guys are the best. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.